Can I get some mad cow? Oh, nah, joking. All right, so we're going to talk prions, okay? Prions. It's actually an acronym. Proteinaceous infectious particles. Prions, okay? Proteinaceous infectious particles really does not roll off the tongue very easily. Prions does, okay? Keep in mind, prions are basically, by their name, infectious particles that are not viruses. These are smaller than viruses. These are actually proteins. There's no genetic material. There's no DNA. There's no RNA. What there is a protein. Say you had a protein that looks like this, and it's in your neurons, okay? This is the normal shape of the protein. A prion looks like this. One is normal. And one, oops, let me do this. One's normal. It's hard to write with a mouse, as you can see. Wow, that's horrible. One's normal, one's not. The one that's not, what it does is it gets into your brain, gets into your neurons. It goes and gets the normal protein and changes its shape. Changes its shape to match the prion. So now instead of one prion, you have two. Both of those go find more of the normal proteins and bend those around. So now instead of 2, you have 4 and 8. And these proteinaceous infectious particle proteins, these prion proteins, will begin to accumulate in a neuron. They will change how that neuron functions, and they will accumulate to the point that that neuron will literally die. It bursts open, releasing the prions to now spread to neighboring neurons, and they start doing it over and over and over. You have what is referred to as a neurodegenerative disease. Okay, it is not a fast onset. This is a chronic problem. It's slow over time. One neuron dies, spreads to a neighboring couple of neurons. Those neurons die, spread to the neighbors. And it's slow accumulation of neurological issues as the neural pathways begin to get interrupted. Different parts of the brain begin to slowly become affected. Now, I made the joke at the beginning of this lecture. Mad cow disease. Mad cow disease is actually caused by a prion. Okay, they refer to it as scrapie in sheep and goats. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy or mad cow disease, BSE. Why do they call it spongiform encephalopathy? Well, because when they went and they did the necropsy, remember necropsy is an autopsy on an animal, when they did the necropsy on these cows that were behaving weird, they were scratching themselves until they were bloody, they couldn't stand, they couldn't walk. When they looked at their brains were riddled with holes. They literally, in a way, resembled sponges. Hence the name, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Encephalopathy meant that there was damage to the brain tissues. And we humans, we have our version of it. We call this, the more common name is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, named after the people who found it and identified it. There's been a few others that are popping up. Gerstmann-Straussler-Steinecker disease. That doesn't roll off the tongue. There's a few fatal familial insomnia that's due to prions that are passed on. We also see this in Pacific Islanders who practice. Oh my God, I cannot think of the name. Who eat the dead. Okay, cannibalism. Phew, could not think of the word. Pacific Islanders, Papua New Guinea, places like that. They thought that once they beat somebody in battle, to take that person's magic, to take that person's power, you had to eat their brains. So they would eat the brains. They would eat part of the person. You know, it's not like they'd sit down with a bowl of brains. They would just eat a little piece or whatever, you know. And also, it was nutrients. The brains, as I've said in the previous lecture, high fat content, lots of calories there, very nutritious. But please don't go all Hannibal Lecter. So what would happen is somewhere along that chain of, you know, defeat a foe, eat the foe, prion was introduced. So that person got eaten, then the next person had prions. At some point in time, they started to show signs and symptoms of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or Kuru, as it's called there in that area, and they would get defeated in battle, and somebody would eat their brains, or a couple of people, and their prions would be passed and passed and passed. For all intents and purposes, dementia, the onset of dementia, memory loss, you start to see everything that says brain involvement, some sort of slow accumulation of brain damage. Okay, this is irreversible. Okay, what you're seeing, the signs and symptoms, are due to the accumulation of brain damage. They're actually now, as a side note, starting to look at Alzheimer's disease and basically the dementia that a lot of elderly patients begin to slowly develop over years as this being some form of a prion-induced disease instead of just, you know, part of growing old, because we've all met elderly people in their 80s and 90s who are mentally aware, who are mentally acute. It's just their bodies may be failing, but their brains aren't. And you've met the flipped. Bodies are good, but their brains just aren't there anymore. Okay? Well, there you go. Chances are there could be a prion disease we just haven't been able to identify yet. Now, as I told you, the normal, and I started to write it and I stopped and just wrote normal, is PRP. Okay, that's the normal host protein is going to be in all of your neurons. It helps in brain development and brain function. What you end up with is a mutation that causes an abnormally formed PRP protein that they will refer to as PRC. PRC will then go and cause PRP to reform. And it just starts this chain of events. Okay? How is it transmissible? Well, you have to eat infected tissue. Okay? You can't just cough on somebody and there you go. No, you have to eat tissues, meat that has the PRC protein in it. And it turns out that that PRC protein is not easily degradable. It doesn't digest in your stomach. It will be absorbed as is. It will be transported around the blood. It will somehow get to the meninges, cross the meninges, and get into the brain. Side note, the way I think I told this story back in the virus chapter, the way that it gets spread through cows is that early on, they were taking waste products from the slaughterhouses, which is, for all intents and purposes, going to be brain, spinal cord tissue, high fat, high calorie. Instead of just throwing it out, they would send it over to the companies that were making cattle feed. Okay, cheap source of fat, cheap source of calories that can be ground up, added to the feed, which then go back to cows. Turns out cows love the taste of feed that has brain tissue in it. They preferentially choose that. Well, that's how they spread it. That's what happened in the British Isles. That's why Britain, for the longest time, was unable to export out any beef. Nowadays, they test every cow for the presence of prions, for mad cow, and any cow, any cow that comes into contact with it, immediately put down, slaughtered, and incinerated. Not allowed to get into the food chain. Here in the States, we don't do that. We only test when it's considered a possible, there may be an issue. Depending on who you talk to, that's good, that's bad. Certain groups say we must test every cow. Other groups saying that's financially, just impossible because there are more cows than people here in the U.S. And unless you want to sit there and pay $20 for a cheap burger at McDonald's, because that's how much the cost would, inflate the price of beef, blah, blah, blah. For us humans, we're a dead end, okay? Unless, again, you're cannibal. We get it. We get exposed to it. We're still not sure how. For Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and things like that. Maybe we're eating contaminated beef or contaminated foodstuffs. And they think there may be genetic components. Some people, if it's a familial thing, just produce a mutated form of the PRP. And it just takes time for that to accumulate to start causing the damage that you would see and you would associate with, dementia. So nowadays, transmission has been cut. Okay, how much we watch for BSE in cattle, but the problem is this is a chronic issue. Okay, you could have eaten, or somebody in your family could have eaten infected beef back in the 90s, early 90s, and it's not going to show up as an issue for 3 or 4 decades. So, patients presenting with dementia, mentally altered. This is now one of those things that during the diagnosis process, you have to add this to the list. What's their diet like? What's their diet always been like? Have they been to some place, on a trip, a few years ago where, hey, mad cow is still an issue. So something to think about from a clinical standpoint.